Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Life, the Complete Story. As always, I am your host, Tyler, joined by my lovely co-host, Alex.
Hello, everybody.
Alright, so today, we're going to continue our quest through the arthropods. Last week we talked about chelicerates, and prior to that we talked about the myriapods. So we've covered spiders and millipedes, and everything in between those. Today we're going to be moving into Crustacea, and Crustacea is one of the larger groups we've talked about throughout the entirety of the show, in terms of diversity per se, not so much species. But with that being said, we'll start with what we always do, our Nature in the News article.
Yes, sir.
And I'll go ahead and give it a go. This article comes from Science Daily. It was published by the Osaka Metropolitan University, so in Japan, and it's a study on cichlid fish using punishment to bring up cooperation. So what it is cichlids, when they breed, they have a dominant breeding pair typically, or a couple pairs, and they have a bunch of helpers that are supposed to guard the nest and defend any intruders. And what this article is showing is that they're using punishment to the more dominant breeding pairs will use a strike on these helpers if they're not doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like a slap in the wrist, go back to your job type thing.
Yeah. Okay.
So it is in the species
Neolamprologus savorii.
Yeah, we'll go with
yeah, that's a tough one. It's a cichlid.
So there's been previous studies on cichlids where they have seen punishment used as cooperative behavior. But what this means is that these fish have a higher cognitive and social skills than we thought.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about vertebrates, fish are bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah.
Every modern day vertebrate stems from fish. And now you're saying that these fish are developing skills that are similar to some of the higher vertebrates like birds and mammals.
Yeah, more actual, not just nesting behavior, but parenting behavior.
Right, as well as just disciplinary behaviors.
Yeah.
That's the big takeaway from this article. It's very small, very quick. So with that, we'll just hop right into the lesson as we... Alex would like to kick it off here.
Yes, sir. So, today we are talking about the crustaceans, which is actually a subphylum of arthropoda. There's a lot of classes that fall into Crustacea. Today, we're going to talk about some of the smaller ones. Would be Ostracoda, Mysticocarida, Ichthyostracca, Theocostraca, Copepoda, Tentulacardia, and Cephalocardia and Brachiopoda, as well as Remipedia. There's one other group as Malacostraca. It's the last class in the crustacean subphylum. That is when you think of crustaceans, that is the class that holds the crabs, the shrimp. That's something that we're going to talk about next week, just because it's a massive group.
Right, it's the biggest group out of all the crustaceans, so we figure we'll try to squeeze all the smaller bits in, because these smaller classes that Alex described are more one or two orders or subclasses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're nowhere near as big. They're usually smaller individuals.
Yeah.
But first, we'll start with our overall. Of course, we say crustaceans is a large, diverse group of mostly aquatic arthropods. There are some that are semi-aquatic, especially when you think of the crabs. The isopods are fully terrestrial.
Right.
So there's some that are fully terrestrial, some that are semi-aquatic, live very near the water. but many of them are fully aquatic, both fresh and saltwater. Um, we have described science has described 67,000 species, uh, ranging from 0.1 millimeters, so very tiny, all the way up to 3.8 meters. So they can get quite large, or they are very small. So similar to the other arthropods, they have an exoskeleton that molts as they grow. This is their shell, quote unquote. That exoskeleton is a little different than, say, the other arthropods we've discussed, because it's typically much harder, a bit thicker. And that comes from the fact that they are larger organisms, and they differ also from the other groups because they have a biramosaur, which are like two parted limbs. So the limbs are actually in like two separate segments. I think is that kind of what that means?
Yeah, so when you look like a crab, we'll say, as our
Yeah.
general general
Yeah.
organism for crustaceans, you know how like the legs kind of like come up and then they come back down, like
Correct. Yeah.
yeah. I don't know how to
Yeah.
visually just show
So
it.
they have a much more defined like segments in the limbs
Right.
that kind of function independently of each other. It's not just like the whole leg moves sort
Yeah.
of thing. Okay. While most crustaceans are free living, there are some that are parasitic. We'll talk about some of those today, and then even sessile, which means they just kind of attach to stuff and sit there, and that's specifically the barnacles.
Yeah, we'll talk
Things.
about them later
Yeah.
on.
So anatomically, our crustaceans, they consist of a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. So they're typically in like a three-part, but some of them are fused together that form that cephalothorax that we talked about with the arachnids. So especially things like crabs, they tend to look like they're just one big body part. And of course, they're covered by a carapace, which we talked about with the horseshoe crabs, where it's kind of just that extra little covering, like the way that
Yeah, it's like
portion of
that
the
the
exoskeleton is.
mantle on top of the
Yeah.
crab or the lobster or whatever is typically what that carapace is,
Yeah.
and all the important bits are underneath of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that main body cavity, they have an open circulatory system, which means the heart just pumps blood into the body, and then the gas exchange just occurs within the body. Crustaceans have both. Some use hemoglobin, so they would, similar to mammals, their blood would be red. They use their the blood cells use that iron compound to transport the oxygen. But there are some, especially within Malacostraca, that have that hemocyanin that we talked about with horseshoe crabs, where their blood would actually be blue because it uses copper.
And we've explained multiple times on the show how hemocyanin differs from hemoglobin.
Yeah.
If you don't remember, you can always go back and double check.
Correct. Yeah. So as far as like the digestive system, it's kind of just a straight tube. They usually have something that's referred to sort of like a gizzard, almost like in birds, where or a gastric mill is what it's referred to as. Kind of just grinds up the food as they eat it. They typically tear the food into small pieces to begin, and then from there it gets ground down even more in this gastric mill. As well, they have some digestive glands that are in kind of like a spiral formation that absorb the food, similar to the way the intestines do in mammals. And then,
so that gastric mill is kind of like an internal radula from the gastropods.
Yes. Yeah. And then they actually, up near their antennae, so that at the front of the crustacean where their antennae would be, they actually have two little structures that function similar to the way the kidneys do, that kind of filter out waste and release it. And then their brain is not like a true brain the way ours is. Typically, it's more of just like a big clump of nerve cells up near the front, kind of close to those antennae. And then they also have a major another big chunk found kind of below the gut. So they almost have like two brains, quote unquote, that help control them. So many of them, They have like this up front, similar to the way the chelicerates did with those pedipalps. They have a similar um, structure, kind of like a small arm that they use to mate. They kind of do that similar, that packet of sperm that they transfer between the males and females. I believe most, if not all, crustaceans are dioecious, like they're separate male and female sexes.
That's what it looks like here.
Yeah.
There's a small number of hermaphroditic
Okay.
species.
Yeah, look like it.
Mostly barnacles,
Yeah.
remipeds.
Yeah. So some of those real small, especially like the barnacles, that makes sense because they don't move.
Yeah, they're sea cells, so most sea cell organisms are hermaphrodite.
Yeah. Typically, the eggs are just released into the water column, while some, like the isopods, actually have a little brood pouch that they the eggs just kind of are carried in, and then from there, once they hatch, they're off to the races. Kind of they go on on their own way. But crustaceans, many of them exhibit a larval form, so they actually go through a sort of a metamorphosis where they have a very small larval form that then, as they grow, shed those exoskeletons. Over time, they start to look more and more like the adult organism. But they start typically incredibly small, almost like when you refer to zooplankton. Sometime we will probably refer to more as we get to the cetaceans, some of the fish.
Yes, definitely.
That they would kind of fall into that range of sizes. So very, very small, tiny little larvae that kind of just float within the water column. They can swim, but they don't swim a ton. They use like a tail, and then their legs they use to swim. Something that's kind of unique to crustaceans, however, is they have a way to repair their DNA. So that's why many crustaceans can live so long. I've heard to it referred, especially in things like lobsters, where really old age doesn't kill lobsters. It's either they're killed by predation or just being unable to. They get too large that they can't molt anymore, and they kind of get stuck, and then just starve to death. So something that's really cool. That ability to repair damaged DNA, especially as they get older. So they really you don't get cancer. Like crustaceans don't get cancer because their bodies are able to repair DNA damage that would cause things like cancer. So that's pretty cool. So now I'll start getting into some of our groups a little bit. We'll start with Ostracoda. So they're called the seed shrimp. There are about 33,000 species have been identified. Only about 13,000 living species. They're very, very small, about 1 millimeter or 0.04 inches in size, but they can range all the way up to 1 inch or less than, or down to 0.008 inches, so like 0.2 to 30 millimeters. Very small. They have both freshwater and saltwater. They kind of are, in most cases, they're typically flattened and like a side to side, so they have a shell similar to the bivalves that kind of hinges through the dorsal regions on the back, and kind of how they move, and they're contained within that sort of shell. They don't, being small, they do tend to have a wide range of diets. There are some that are actually carnivorous, but many are herbivorous, so they eat like plant, algae, and they scavenge as well, and then some filter feed. But most are like deposit feeders, so kind of when you get that ocean fall, that ocean snow, I think is what most would feed on. So the kind of that dead, decaying matter is what they would feed on. So kind of a smaller group, kind of have that head thorax region, not too much of an abdomen, just because of the way their shell is contained. Typically, the head is the largest part of the body, and that's where the arms or legs are kept. So it's like I said, not a very like flashy group. A lot of very small, kind of part of that zooplankton niche as well. Like I said, kind of either on that upper layer of the, or out kind of around the sea floor, kind of just floating within the water column. So found all over. But some of the freshwater species tend to be found in those moist, humid forest soils in areas like South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. More of those tropical kind of environments.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and they are bioluminescent, which is very cool. So when it's dark, they'll actually produce their own light. So next, we will move on to Mystacocaridia. Yeah.
Yeah. You want me to cover that one, Alex?
Yeah, go for it.
So, this is a subclass of Crustacea, as all these are. They are marine crustaceans in the benthic zone, so that's like deeper water, more seafloor type area.
Mm-hmm.
They are kind of odd in shape compared to others. They kind of look like a centipede with extra fuzz on it. If you would pull a picture while I go over this.
I am on.
So they have a more conservative taxonomy because they all have the same general shape. So it's kind of difficult to like determine without using genetics.
And they're very small.
And they're very small, right? There's about 13 described species of them.
Okay.
They live along the coasts of the Americas and southern Africa, as well as the western Mediterranean. The lack of sampling, like we just have a lack of sampling to really verify that they're in other parts of the world, like Asia and Australia and things like that. I'm sure they are. Crustaceans are pretty widespread, especially these very small ones. So they have two long pairs of antennae. You can kind of see in the picture.
Yeah.
A pair of limb-like mandibles, which are kind of hard to see unless all these bigger legs. No. Yeah, it's kind of hard to really tell what's what in this image.
So it'd be near.
Yeah, they'd be up in that area there.
Okay. So I'm
and
not
two
sure
pairs.
if this first pair of what looks like legs may be part of that, or they're tucked underneath and we can't see it just because of the way the image is.
Right, and they have two pairs of maxillae, which are much longer than those on the thorax and have a number of fine hairs that they use to strain detritus. So they're filter feeders of that, like they use that white snow that we talk about pretty often, actually. But that's mostly it on these. Like I said, there's only a couple species, and we haven't really done a lot of studies on them since they live so deep. It's hard to really sample them. So we'll move on into our next group. Alex, if you'd like to cover the Ichthyostracca.
Yeah, so Ichthyostracca, there's not a ton about these, but they are kind of interesting. They are the tongue lice and the fish lice. So they're somewhat smaller, but not. Some are a little bigger. So these are some of them are called tongue worms. So they look very similar to what you would think. They kind of a long worm-like structure, but they are crustaceans. There are about 130 species of this subclass of those tongue lice, which is Pentastomida. And they use their front appendages to attach to the tongue of the fish that they parasitize and basically become the fish's tongue is what they do. So they devour the tongue that the fish has and then become the tongue in replacement. And then as the fish feeds, they also eat the food that comes through, and as well as any of the blood that they're able to get from the base of the tongue that they attach to. There are some also they get into the respiratory tracts of vertebrates, so they get a little farther along than just the tongue. but some can get quite large, up to 14 centimeters, so 5.5 inches. So some do get quite large. Many are a little smaller, only about one centimeter or about half an inch in length. And then that other group, the fish lice, they kind of are more external parasites. They just attach to the body of the fish with their legs, kind of grab on. They have more of like a flattened shape, and a similar thing. They just parasitize on the fish and use the fish's feeding to feed the parasite by consuming the blood of the fish. So not too crazy. They're a bit smaller, typically only about an inch or 30 millimeters in length. Although the females do get a little larger. They're pretty much found throughout the world. So something that you can see on fish, both freshwater, saltwater, throughout the world. Most are found in like the Africa and South America regions. Yeah. In North America, as far as freshwater is concerned, there is only one species that is known. It is one genus. It is the genus Argulus, that's found in the freshwater systems of North America. And of course, none found in Antarctica because of the cold. There's not quite as many fish that live in that area.
Righto.
Yeah. So, yeah. Unfortunately, we know that these groups aren't quite as exciting as some of the other the groups. Next group we're going to go into, Theocostraca, which is the barnacles. A little more interesting, a little more exciting. Yeah.
So, as much as we say they're more interesting, they're sessile organisms. They are Theocostraca. There's about 2,200, so a little bit more than the past two groups we covered.
Yeah.
And they often have a very planktonic larva, which are often sessile or parasitic as adults. There's a lot of suborders of barnacles, but as you'll see barnacles most often on man-made structures or on larger vertebrate species. Whales often harbor them. More
large sea turtles.
Yeah, large, slow-moving organisms often have them. So yeah, they're let's see here. Let's try to find us
And a good subclass, and I'll find us a picture.
Yeah, they're suspension feeders, especially in the subclass Ceropedia. So they're encrusters. So the actual barnacle itself is inside like that dome-shaped structure you see on these structures. It's more of a So that white bit is the crust, and then that orange bit on this tail is the actual organism itself.
So similar to how the corals did, the actual living organisms, the inside part, and they have kind of just a protective layer on the outside that they build up.
Right, and they live on their stomach, so that's like the backside of the barnacle itself.
So that's how they anchor, basically. They kind of grab on.
Right, and when they feed, they kind of push out their legs, and they act as filters to pull into the substrate into their gut.
Okay.
And they reproduce most often hermaphroditically, so they'll like release their eggs from their ovary, and then they have another like tail that comes out that acts as the penis to release the sperm.
Okay.
And the eggs get released in the water column, fertilize, and then the larvae, although free moving, don't have any type of movement, like type of like flagella or any.
So they kind of just float, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay. Kind of just floating around, waiting for something to come along, or if they settle to the sea floor.
Right.
At which point they attach and develop to these more adult forms, like you can see in the image here.
Yeah. But that's really gonna do it for Thickostracca. Uh, Pretty cool for being so solid. They're pretty cool in the way that they feed.
Okay.
So that'll move us on to the copepods.
Yeah. So Copepoda is another group of those real small crustaceans. Like we said, there's about 16,000 species that are divided into 10 orders. Of those species, 13,000 are maroon. There's 13,000 species, and then like roughly 3,000 of them are freshwater. So very small. The copepod means oar feet, so you can see those little at the back. On many of them, they have those little oars. That's how they swim around. There are some that are go through parasitic phases, but most are not obligate parasites the way that we've talked about some of the other these past few groupings of crustaceans. Many live kind of that I said, that planktonic. They kind of just float within the water column. Some live on sediments, and then there are some that actually live in terrestrial habitats that are like moist habitats, so swamps, bogs, damp moss, or plants like bromeliads and pitcher plants that have that hold a lot of water. They'll actually live within there as well. And then they found them in underwater caves, both freshwater and marine, sinkholes, stream beds. So they're found all over the place. But the cool thing about these is they can actually be used as biodiversity indicators. So the more types of copepods you find is a good indicator that some of the higher organisms that could be within that area tend to have a better biodiversity as well. So that's something that is looked for a lot when doing some of those kind of aquatic studies, those diversity studies, especially in areas where pollution is very prevalent.
Yeah, so they're used not only as a biodiversity indicator, but as a water quality index type
Yes.
benchmark.
Yeah. So, as I said, very small, 1 to 2 millimeters. So like a like a 16th of an inch, roughly, very small. They have that big teardrop-shaped body with a large antenna. And they do have kind of that armored exoskeleton that you can see, but since they are so small, it's relatively thin, and to the point that they are transparent. Most of them just have like a single eye. You can see on some of them between that little orange dot.
This little orange dot at the top.
Yeah, that is just, it's a single, but it is a compound eye. And as I said, typically bright red. There are, especially the subterranean species, they are eyeless because it's dark. They don't need to use, there's really no reason to waste energy on eyes that can't do anything. And there are some, and a couple genera, that actually have 2 eyes. I think they're probably some of the ones that may be a little bit more carnivorous, eat some other of those zooplankton, kind of move a little more. So,
the more predatory species.
Yeah, definitely. Just trying to see anything else that would be kind of. So some do exhibit bioluminescence, so very, very cool. But they're not, as far as what they do, as far as like feeding life cycle. Like I said, that feeding, many kind of filter feed, or a lot of them also eat phytoplankton, so even smaller than the zooplankton, more of those plant-like plankton, those algae that float within the water column. And actually, even a single copepod, as small as it is, can eat almost 400,000 individual phytoplankton in a day. So they are actually very useful in helping prevent things like algal blooms, those plankton blooms, because they eat so many of those organisms, as well as some of that detritus and bacteria that are within the water column, kind of help with that ocean cleanup sort of niche within the ecology. So very cool. As we said, important a lot to like that ecology and that carbon cycle is something we haven't talked about before, but kind of that that energy movement where you start at the base, like with those phytoplankton, those algae move upwards, and then as well them being some being detritivores. As those larger organisms die, they help break that back down into that base carbon, and then those detritivores can be eaten by larger organisms. So they are dominant members of that zooplankton. So very big part of the that like first layer of our I can't remember the name right now. That like energy pyramid where like they're that first primary consumer kind of. They're the things that eat those more plant like organisms, so make up a pretty important part. A lot of small fish are what eat them, as well as some large organisms like cetaceans, so whales that filter feed. And we'll talk about that more when we get to them, how they do that. So very, very, very important, found worldwide. It can make up to 80% of the zooplankton biomass across the world. So, like I said, a major part of our trophic pyramid. That's what I was thinking of. Yeah, so very cool. Very cool indeed. A little more interesting than some of these other ones. Like I said, for something so small, they play a very big role in the environment. So very cool. Something I know we've talked about a lot, especially like we said with those like pollution indicators, those water quality indicators. Something that is looked at a lot when we're looking for some of that ecological testing, and kind of help us get a good idea of what the water looks like. So, I don't know, Ty, if you have anything to add for the copepods. If not, we can move on to our next group.
Yeah, so they're typically a big part of like the hobbyist aquariums, especially
Okay.
saltwater tanks. They help
Okay.
provide like a zooplankton food source for some species, as well as they've been known to be found in water supplies of various countries, including the U.S., where we have better filtration than some of those other countries. In some of the tropical countries, they've been known to be correlated to like cholera outbreaks.
Okay.
So, because the cholera like bacteria lives on these planktonic organisms, so they're not exactly filtered through as well
Okay.
in those areas. And
Yeah.
that can be known to cause cholera, as well as guinea worm outbreaks.
Okay. Yeah.
They eat the guinea worm larva
Yes, that's
yeah.
where I'd heard it talked about a lot, is because they believe they're actually the guinea worm larvae have to be eaten by the copepods, because that's what eats, like the snails eat the copepods, which then or something eats the copepods, which then allows the guinea worm to develop into its adult form, that would then infect humans and adult, like that mammal host that is like the final host, where the full adult then releases like it's the eggs, that larval, and then you repeat the cycle over again. So yeah, I knew that there was a reason I had thought that they were very important. I couldn't remember why.
Right. And with that water supply, as much as I talk about cholera and stuff in um, South America and Asia, in New York, it kind of leads to arguments in a sense of the Jewish community. Is it kosher and not to drink the water that has the copepods?
Okay.
Because New York City doesn't have mechanical filters, so you have to like filter it yourself.
Okay.
And a lot of different like kosher certification industries are like, yeah, you can drink it as long as you filter it beforehand. Just a little tidbit, not really anything ecological or anything like
Yeah.
that, but just cool.
Just a cool thing.
Just cool information.
Okay. Yes, and so with that'll move us on to our next group, which is the Tantulicardia.
Right.
So
These are a group of parasitic crustaceans with 33 species. They are typically ectoparasites and infect other crustaceans. They have no eyes. They have a oil disc on their head. I'm trying to figure out how to elaborate that. Probably in A, you can kind of see that, like, in diagram A,
yeah,
that big, like, organ at the top
yeah,
there. I'd
yeah,
assume that's that disc.
yeah. I think in diagram B, you can see this little where my cursor is at right now. This little part right at the end of the head, that little kind of disc shape. That I think it'd be. That's kind of where they would attach, right?
Yes.
Okay.
They have a 6-segmented thorax. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in diagram E for our video listeners. Apologies to our audio listeners only, but that just gives you another excuse to watch it on YouTube
Yeah.
afterwards. And they have a limbless abdomen consisting of 1 to 6 segments in addition to a tail sac.
Okay.
They have a unique lifestyle among all other crustaceans. They have a larva that transforms directly from a non-feeding and free-swimming organism into the parasite without any, like, instar.
Okay.
So it's a flip-flop. It just goes non-feeding to parasite.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. And so, like you can see, kind of in the picture, very small. Even they'll actually parasitize the copepods that we were just talking about, which are also very tiny.
right. I don't have an exact size for you in terms of how big they are, but if they're feeding on copepods, isopods, and other small crustaceans, they're smaller.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. I found the body length. I just didn't look hard enough. Less than 0.3 millimeters in
Okay.
length. But as I was saying about the life cycle, in that parasitic stage, they lose a lot of their muscle systems, a lot of degeneration in terms of their body. But the body does become bigger itself, but all the functionality of it kind of ceases.
Okay.
It is permanently attached to the host, so once it attaches, it's there till it dies. They have a rootlet system that they use to absorb the nutrients from a stylet is the term that they use,
Okay.
which is kind of like a syringe, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And they they release like a rootlet system to absorb the nutrients from their host.
Okay.
And it says that the adult form develops inside the larva, and it can become either a sac-like female or a fully developed, free-living, non-feeding, and sexually reproducing male or female.
Okay. So only the females are the ones that actually attach to parasitize.
Right. The
Okay.
parthenogenetic females are.
Okay.
The eggs are eventually released as fully developed larvae, and it says that the non-feeding larvae produced by the sexual females hatch as Naupli, which is another's like form.
Okay.
But that's it. The most important thing you gotta know is they have a unique life cycle compared to other crustaceans. And that'll move us into the Cephalocarida, also known as the horseshoe shrimp.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as Tyler said, this grouping, they're referred to as horseshoe shrimp. So if you remember the horseshoe crabs that we talked about, where they have that very big carapace at the front, kind of that horseshoe shape, kind of dome shape, they have something similar to that. Mostly, although it's a little bit more, or I should, it's not quite as developed. As mostly just the head. Kind of similar to the same size as the main body. There's only 12 species that are within this grouping, and they are either that Naupli, which I believe they kind of grow. Yes, it says they kind of grow through that larval form into the adult. So that nauple is kind of like that larval immature stage, and then the adults are benthic, so they are probably just detritivores. You see here. Yeah. So they feed on marine detritus, so they're kind of similar to how some of the copepods are, where they just feed on the bottom of the seafloor or in that intertidal zone, in the sediment on those dead those dead particles, helping to reintroduce that as just kind of the pure carbon in their as they excrete their waste. They said that real long slender, you can see that center groove similar to most shrimp, kind of have like what we call the vein in shrimp is actually the digestive system, and that's where those food particles are passed through that groove, and then so we said, as we said, very small, the about 2 to 4 millimeters, so from about 0.08 inches to 1.6 inches in length. They actually do have a heart, for as small as they are, which is pretty cool. And then their head, like you see that large head, and then the rest of it, kind of a thorax, which they have nine limb-bearing segments. So they have very small little legs underneath those front handful of sections, and then back to the abdomen, which are 10 segments that are limbless, and then that telson at the very end. So they're kind of ring-shaped in the larvae, and then they're a bit more flattened as they become adults. Living in that sediment, it's better to be that more flatter shape. And they have no eyes, mostly because they live within the sediment, kind of that, or like at the very top layer of sediment. So they more just feel their way around to find food. And, they do have mandibles that flank the mouth, and they have a very small pair of maxillae that help them move food around. And as I said, with that groove, they kind of move that using their legs. They kind of generate currents that allow them to kind of float the food along the base up toward the mouth, along like a groove structure, which probably runs between the legs into the mouth. So another important organisms. They help with that final level of our trophic pyramid. Help kind of clean up is a good way to describe the detritivores. They help clean up all the dead stuff that is left, as the larger organisms feed and do their thing. So he said another one of those small groups, not super exciting, but cool nonetheless. Cool little guys, kind of doing an important job. So next we'll move into a slightly bigger group, the brachiopods.
Right. So the brachiopods are comprised of the fairy shrimp, clam shrimp, Diplostracca, Notostracca.
Yeah, so the Diplostracca is our water fleas, and Notostracca, they're tadpole or shield shrimp. They're kind of cool looking.
So let's pull up an image, Alex, while I go over.
Yeah.
Members of Brachiopoda have gills, unlike other crustaceans that we've talked about so far, correct?
I
don't remember talking
I'm
about
not
gills.
sure. I don't think we've talked about gills. I know most crustaceans do have gills, if not all.
But also a lot of them are. Never mind.
No, they. You're right. They just absorb through their through the exoskeleton. They just absorb those gases.
Right.
So this is a little bit more
advanced.
Yeah, that they actually have gills that help improve that gas exchange.
Right. And these gills are present on the appendages.
Okay.
So within the appendages, some have them even on their mouth parts.
Okay. So you can see in the water flea, I'm guessing as part of this mouth part appendage, these real fine kind of little fuzzy hairs on here are
what would that's be how they get their name, brachiopods.
Okay.
because it's Greek for gill foot.
Okay.
Yeah, they mostly have compound eyes, as you can see in the water flea, and the water flea is the bottom right for those who
Yeah. Yeah.
are
So I think top left would be our fairy shrimp, and then our shield shrimp, and
yes,
then our clam shrimp, of course, and then the bottom right is the water flea. So that'd
right.
be top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right.
You can see those compound eyes in 3 of the 4 pictures. Like the clam shrimp, it's kind of hard to see any type of uh, specializations they have. They really do resemble a clam.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they have that carapace in some species, which could either be that shell in the clam shrimp, so the two-valved shell is their carapace. Broad and shallow, which would be in the helmet shrimp,
Mm-hmm.
or absent, like in water fleas and fairy shrimp.
Yeah.
The antennae are used for locomotion. Don't know how. I guess in the water flea it makes sense,
Yeah. They don't really
but
have legs.
right.
Or the legs are very small.
Um, most of these species are freshwater. Some live in brackish water, so that estuary,
Yeah.
like intertidal zone of fresh and salt water.
Okay.
And there are 2 groups of water fleas in marine species, um, Podonidae and Cetidae. And they mostly eat, most brachiopods eat detritus and plankton, so they fit in that scavenger type or primary consumer type,
Yeah.
which they take using the setae or the setae on their appendages, which is those bristle hairs that you can see in most of these organisms.
Okay.
However, some are omnivorous and will even eat algae and bacteria as a predator or as a scavenger. Specifically, the fairy shrimp are up to 25 millimeters long. However, there are some exceptional species that have grown to 6.7 inches,
Oh
which is pretty.
wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's actually quite large.
Most have 20 body segments, with 11 pairs of swimming legs, and they lack a carapace. And they live in the vernal pools, which are like the seasonal ponds, like that show up during your rainy seasons, or your hypersaline lakes, um, which would be like your salt lakes, uh, the Great Salt Lake, other things like that. Not
Like,
so much like oceanic saline levels though.
okay.
And they can be found in deserts as well as Antarctica.
Okay.
Yeah, just in terms of like their broad habitat, they could be found everywhere, but the difference between a desert and Antarctica is pretty vast.
Yeah. Oh, Antarctica is
A
kind of a
desert. It's a
desert.
cold desert. It's a
Yeah.
cold desert. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the Notostraca is comprised of the family Triopsidae, which is the tadpole shrimp and the shield shrimp. And they were considered living fossils similar to the horseshoe crab and things of that nature.
Okay.
They haven't really changed since the Triassic period. They have that broad, flat carapace, which conceals the head and bears their compound eyes. They have a long, flattened leg, long abdomen with flattened legs, and a telson at the rear. Um, I don't really have a size for them, but they're macroscopic in comparison
So
to.
they look like they're a little bigger, probably a few centimeters, so
Yeah,
like a quarter of an inch roughly. A little bit bigger, something like you could actually see that
yeah,
swimming.
visible to the naked eye, but not large.
Yeah.
The clam shrimp are the bivalve shell. Um, they're about as old as the Devonian period.
Okay.
They have about 10 to 32 segments, decreasing in size from the front to the back. And each bears a pair of legs, which also have gills on them.
Okay.
Then they have the water fleas, which have about 620 species. They're ubiquitous in aquatic habitats, but rare in oceans, like in
Okay.
the freshwater habitats.
Yeah.
So about 0.2 to 6 millimeters, so about a hundredth of an inch to a quarter inch long. They have a downturned head. Uh, they have a carapace that covers the unsegmented thorax and abdomen. There's a single compound eye. You can kind of see it there in the picture.
Yeah.
Um,
Right at the very front.
they have cyclical parthenogenesis, where you kind of have asexual reproduction, but there's occasionally a supplement of sexual reproduction. In the event of like environmental stressors, they can use it to like
Kind
have a harder egg that will survive longer.
of. Okay. A little more because it at that point would because of the sexual reproduction, it develops a little bit more. Just starting from an egg, it's a little bit more developed, a little stronger, a little
Yeah.
hardier.
So with that, I'll leave it to Alex to cover our last grouping of crustaceans for the day, the remipedes.
Remipedes, yes. So, bringing us home for today. So the Remipedia, they are a class of they're all blind. They're actually very closely related to hexapods. So our insects, everything that falls within the class Hexapoda. So they're more closely related to them than many of the other crustaceans. Found in a lot of different places, coastal aquifers, which underground, so that's saline groundwater, so that's saltwater groundwater. Every ocean basin that has been explored, Australia, the Caribbean, a lot of the Atlantic Ocean. It's very old. The first described fossil is from the lower Pennsylvanian period, so that's getting into right after like the end of the Carboniferous, getting into the Permian. So kind of right as that that big expansion was coming. So pretty small, 1 to 4 centimeters or 0.4 to 1.6 inches long. They have the head and an elongated trunk of up to 32 body segments that are all pretty similar. Like we said, eyes are absent. They're all blind. They don't have any pigmentation as well, so they're all going to be like this white color. They do have those biramous swimming appendages that are present on every segment. So while they move slowly, but they are able to swim. They actually swim on their backs. And then the only known venomous crustacean, they do have fangs, which they use to inject both the digestive enzymes and venom into prey. So they can be carnivorous as well as filter feeding. And they are hermaphroditic. So they have both a female and a male pore. The female pore is located on the 7th segment of that kind of those trunk segments, while the male pore would be found on the 14th. So they're separated, but they're close enough that they could self-fertilize, but they're also far enough away that they are able to reproduce their asexual or sexual reproduction as well.
So in the image here, the first asterisk is the male, right? The 7th is the male.
I believe that'd be the female.
The female is the top one,
Yes,
and the male is the 14th
correct.
one. Okay, so the top asterisk is the female reproductive uh, section, and the 14th, the second asterisk, is the male reproductive section.
Okay. They are, like we said, they're very old. They're the only known extant pan crustaceans, which is like the, trying to, as I pull pan crustacea here. So it includes all crustaceans, and is that pan crustacea, but they're of a smaller grouping of pan crustacea, kind of a very small clade of itself. So they're similar to those tadpole shrimp. They're basically a living fossil, and they lack things. They lack gills, so they just kind of through their body they have the gas exchange. However, they do have like enhanced olfactory, so like for smell, that they do have enhanced nerve centers that allow them to sense smells. A lot of that probably has to do with them living in dark environments, being blind, and it seems that their free living larvae are non-feeding, and they don't a lot of the digestive organs don't appear until they're in more of a juvenile stage. And it is possible, because of the energy that is required to swim, molt, and grow, that it has been speculated that they actually may have symbiotic bacteria as well as like the yolk from the egg, as they grow larger. So that will wrap up the Remipedia. So that will bring us to a close today for our lesson of all these groupings of Crustacea. And these are not the big exciting ones that most people think of when they think of crustaceans. That'll be next week when we cover Malacostraca, which is our last group of Crustacea. And I think our last group of arthropods besides Hexapoda, I believe.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, with that, since we've been talking about these living fossils, I figure we talk about a not so living fossil, and we start with our from the vault.
Okay.
So today's from the vault is going to be the Dolicharis, which is cool. It just looks cool. Just look at this. This little dude.
A funky little guy.
He looks so happy.
It does.
But the Dolicharis is an extinct genus of crustacean that lived during the Jurassic period. So around the time of dinosaurs, we have found fossils in France. Specifically, I'm not even going to try.
I say La Vult-Serron Lagerstadt, I think is.
That one. Yep.
Yeah.
Good job.
Yeah. That's I did not take French. That is about as close as you're gonna get.
Right. So if you couldn't guess, they're known for these big, giant, compound eyes they have. Very well done in the artist rendition. The adult specimens have been seen to be a foot in length, and they kind of have a row of small appendages to assist in swimming, as well as 3 pairs of clawed segments. So, for our video listeners, you can kind of tell which one's which, but I'll try to give up my best description for our audio-only listeners. It's a large carapace area with these big compound eyes, and they have a row of smaller swimming appendages, kind of similar to the remipedes that we talked about.
Yeah, they're kind of straight, flat sort of appendages that I'm guessing would just move back and forth to kind of propel them a little bit.
And then they kind of have 2 pairs of like maxillae, would be my best description of it.
Yeah.
Smaller, have more grippy hairs than claws, that kind of force the food into the mouth, and they have a large pair of claws. Or at least the arms are large. The claws themselves look rather small in comparison. So they might not have been grabbing large food, but the actual claw itself, the actual arms itself, um, they are believed to be poor swimmers, depending on ambush. And it makes sense because of these legs we talked about. They're kind of flat and more like oars that just row around.
So they would use like those, especially that set of real long clawed arms to kind of extend those out real quick, grab whatever prey they're on, pull it in, and then grip onto those two other sets of arms that allowed them to eat.
Right. That's kind of gonna do it for the Dolicharis. There's not a whole bunch around it in terms of studies.
It's just cool looking.
They just look funny. That's why I picked it.
Yeah, they're kind of funny looking, but they're very cool. Nice.
With that, we'll move on to Alex for his most wanted.
Yeah, so our most wanted for this week is an invasive species. It is the rusty crayfish. It is Fexonius rusticus is the scientific name for it. Found in a lot of the eastern United States. Yeah, the Great Lakes states especially, but along New England, kind of the northeastern United States, down the coast to the North Carolina, Tennessee, as well as in the West Coast, like Colorado, Wyoming, and Oregon, and then in Ontario, Canada. So they're native to the Ohio River Basin, especially parts of Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. So they are. This is an example of a somewhat native species that got out of its natural range and has become invasive elsewhere within the same country, actually. So something that can occur. It doesn't have to be from the other side of the world. So, like most crayfish, they have that lobster-like body. They're brown in color. That's why they're called the rusty crayfish. They're like that rusty kind of brownish orange color. Get up to 6 inches in length with their large claws. And then, of course, the mature crayfish, they actually have a dark rusty spot on either side of the carapace. So that brown color, they have a little red spot on the side of the carapace as well. Found in pretty much any permanent body of water. So lake, streams, wetlands, especially if they have a lot of rocks, logs, trees that allow for cover. They do not burrow, however, like most other crayfish do. They kind of just are there. They'll probably hide under those rocks and logs, but they don't burrow into the sediment. And they, of course, they're very voracious eaters, consuming 2 to 3 times as much per day as a native crayfish, especially in those areas where they're outside of their native range, they can eat 2 to 3 times more than those native crayfish that live there. And they'll eat pretty much whatever's available that they can catch and eat. So plants, snails, clams, insects, even other crayfish, and fish eggs, and even small fish. They're small enough that they can catch them. The big concern is because they destroy those aquatic plant beds. Like I said, they eat plants. They destroy aquatic plant beds and cause a lot of problems with those other organisms. They eat a lot and are as they reproduce, make more crayfish, kind of compounds the problem with that intense feeding. And because they grow pretty large, they don't. Other crayfish really don't go after them, and it's even difficult for some of those larger predatory fish to catch them just because they are large, have those large claws. And kind of the reason that they were introduced to these non-native areas is because they were collected and used as bait for fishing, and some that say if people were done fishing and just dumped like a bucket, those couple left over crayfish, or if some got off the hooks and survived, after being hooked, then they were able to survive wherever they were the folks were fishing at, and thus causing them to be introduced, and they became invasive as they thrived in those newer environments where they had fewer predators, and were able to outcompete the the native species that were there. So, like I said, something that while it's native to part of the United States, kind of that Midwestern, northern Midwest area, they have become invasive in even areas that are relatively close to that. Such as like here where we live in Pennsylvania, we live very close to the Ohio River Basin, but in places that are outside of that area, like the Great Lakes area, like Lake Erie area, as well as out in the eastern part towards the coast, they have become invasive. So they don't have to go far to become an invasive species. That's what that kind of base definition of invasive species is: just a species that is a non-native species that has grown and thrived to the point that it is outcompeting native species to a significant level that it is causing harm to those native species by getting rid of food or in taking up habitat. Yeah.
All right. Anything else to add, Alex?
For these guys, no, that's pretty much the extent of it. I can real quick pull up a picture of what they look like.
Yeah, that's on me for not doing that while
That's
you were
okay.
talking.
Just to give folks an idea, when I said that rusty crayfish, right there you go. You can see that little red spot where they get what they're talking about. But they are relatively large crayfish that can be found in those. Here's another picture. You can see a person's thumb in relation to the size of the crayfish. Pretty decent size.
They are rather large for like a crayfish type species.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So with that, I guess that leads us into the final segment for the day, the amazing species of the day.
Fantastic.
And today I chose Myctocaris halope, which is an odd species to say the least, and they kind of fit with what we talked about today.
Oh, there you go. I was just going to get it.
This is the only species of cave crustacean in the monotypic genus Myctocaris, and it's in its own family, Myctocarididae, and is sometimes the only member of its order, Myctaceae. So very, very isolated in terms of taxonomy. They only live in the anchyline pools, which are like those blue holes that we talk. That's a more common name. It's basically just a cave that has access to the ocean. It's a filled up cave of water.
Okay.
That empties into the ocean. So they're about 3.5 millimeters long, so a little bit more than 1/10 of an inch. And they live in Bermuda, specifically the Crystal Cave, the Green Bay Cave, the Roadside Cave, and Tucker's Town Cave. They're rarely encountered because they live so deep in these caves, and they try to remain isolated, so you won't see a whole bunch in one area. And if you capture one and put it in captivity, they try to prefer the walls and other surfaces of the glass rather than free floating throughout. We don't know what it eats. There hasn't been enough research done on it, but they do have well-developed molar and mandible muscles, so they can chew pretty well. And they are now we have 56 specimens collected, and they are at the National Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And they're critically endangered by the IUCN due to extreme fragmentation. They're only found in these 4 caves, so population is decreasing, and like interbreeding is a big thing because they can't leave the cave. This was assessed in 2013 and published in 2014. We don't have a set number in the population. They have been known to be under threat by human disturbance, mining, quarrying, things that would disturb the cave systems,
Mhm.
lead to interference there, as
Okay.
well as like wastewater,
Yeah.
like leaking into the cave systems.
Okay.
They're not really used as pets, uh,
Probably due to their size, and
due to size. Yeah,
it's
we haven't.
probably difficult to keep them.
And Bermuda protects them as a critical. Declared their caves as critical habitat. They're under like the Bermuda's Protected Species Act. And we're trying to do, not we, but Bermuda is trying to do some type of restoration of these caves to make them more suitable for this species. It's one of the only, I'd say, one of the only endemic species to Bermuda in terms of marine life.
Okay.
But that'll do it for our amazing species of the day. And with that, that'll end our episode for the day. As always,
Yes, sir.
follow us on Instagram at Life Complete Story. Follow us on Facebook at Life the Complete Story. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Ring the notification bell so you can get notified of all new podcast episodes. And follow. Oh yeah, YouTube is Life the Complete Story. And follow us on Spotify if you watch us on YouTube at Life the Complete Story as well. Or send us an email. You guys that watch, let us know what you found interesting, what we missed, what you want us to add, and you can email us at lifecompletestory@gmail.com.
Yes, sir.
Am I missing anything?
I believe you got it all. It says social medias, Facebook, Instagram. Of course, follow us. We do our best sometimes to include some things that we don't talk about in the episodes that we enjoy, some kind of side things that we go and do if we get a little bonus content, something from our own travels and time spent out in nature. So definitely something to check out. And then, as well as I said, with Spotify, YouTube, subscribe, follow us, give us a rating.
Do the algorithm things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But as always, Alex,
Learn something new.
yep,
Keep
you never
on.
know what you're gonna learn.
Yes, sir. Keep on learning.
There we go.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And next week we'll be continuing our dive to the arthropods. We'll talk about the rest of the crustaceans. You're
And
not going to want to miss it.
Hopefully, soon after, we will have a special episode covering the insects and hexapoda.
Yes, sir. Yeah, because that's gonna be quite a bear, and we've been talking about doing a bit of a super episode for that one. So stay tuned.
I look forward to it. As is Alex. We'll
Yes,
catch you guys next week for Malacstraka.